Hello, everyone, and welcome to another segment of our How to Heal Our Divides book discussion. I'm here today with Betty Pries, co-founder and CEO at Credence & Company, and contributor to the second How to Heal Our Divides book. Betty's also the author of a book titled The Space Between Us, Conversations about Transforming Conflict that came out from Herald Press. With over 28 years of experience coaching, mediating, training, facilitating, and consulting, Betty's a highly regarded conflict, change, and leadership specialist. She's a specialist in equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI, leading anti-racism, anti-prejudice workshops, supporting EDI committees, reviewing and writing EDI-related policies, coaching leaders, and offering support to organizations wrestling with EDI challenges. Betty has a PhD from the Free University Amsterdam on the topic of conflict transformation. She's a chartered mediator with the ADR Institute of Canada and a member of the ADR Institute of Ontario. Betty's a regular instructor at the University of Waterloo. And you can learn more about Betty and all of her work at bettypries.ca. So Betty, thanks so much for joining us today, and congratulations again on all of your incredible work.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it. It's good to be here.
So I'll ask, Betty, a series of questions, but if anyone else would like to do that as well, you can raise your hand through the raise hand function on the Zoom portal or type something into the chat box. Either way is fine. So Betty, maybe to get started, what else would you like people to know about you than what the things are that I briefly touched on?
Sure. Maybe the one thing, I've got a personal life, obviously, outside of work, but maybe related to this, the one thing that I would say is that I love what I do. There are challenges, of course, but I feel like I'm privileged every single day to have conversations with people about topics that matter, about how people show up in the world and how they contribute to making the world a more livable place. And not everybody has that kind of a job where they get to do that on a 24/7 kind of a basis. And for me, those are the conversations that make my day sing, is these conversations about meaning and purpose and belonging and things like that. So it's a gift to be involved in this work. That's maybe the only thing I'd add.
Well, I could totally see that. Just having the chance to help as many people and organizations through what are some tough but really important issues has got to be pretty gratifying.
It is. And when people trust you, I was working with a leader recently who was telling me, okay, Betty, this is how I show up. And I get it that it's not working for people. So what do I need to do differently? And that kind of openness to be thinking about how do I show up in order to make my workplace more livable for the people around me. What an opportunity, right? What a gift to be able to have those important conversations. So when I have conversations like that with people, and I get to be part of that journey with folks, it's sacred ground every time. Yeah, it is.
You use the word trust, which is really, for me, an incredibly important word. And there was a business book written a few years ago called The Speed of Trust that I just absolutely loved. And I'm thinking, about possibly writing a book myself about some aspects of that. How do you find in the work that you do with the different organizations in particular that kind of growing levels of trust is crucial to making anything else happen?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, what's interesting about that question that you're offering, I think connected with the book, The Speed of Trust, one of the things they talk about is that you can only move at the speed of trust, right?
Yes.
So, and in terms of my work, if I can sort of take a step back from your question, my ability to accompany an organization also depends on moving at the speed of trust. So, somebody was asking me this week, well, why don't you just tell them, it's like, well, you can't really do that. You have to move. You have to build trust and move at the speed of trust in terms of helping. If you really want to be an agent of change, you got to build trust. And then I sometimes describe it as putting money into an emotional bank account or a trust bank account. And you build trust, and then you can withdraw from that account to have some hard conversations. And then you keep building trust and have those hard conversations. So that's in terms of my accompanying the organization. But then when you think of the organization itself, and in particular the leadership within the context of that organization, is how do leaders really build trust in their context? And I think about trust as from a couple of different perspectives. One of them is, these different pillars of trust.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the pillars of trust is consistency. Am I consistent as a leader? Do I have the competency to be in this leadership role? But then those are about my skill sets. But then there are other ones which are more, I guess, emotional intelligence oriented, such as, do I show care? Am I a person of character, which is different than showing care? Is my communication regular and healthy? So there's all these C words
Yes.
that connected to those pillars of trust, and effective leaders or effective workplaces depend on a mutually trusting environment. That depends on a leader who models that and shows that on a regular basis. And so the interesting thing about organizational health and group health of any type, and societal health really, is that our leaders, at whatever level of society you're describing it, are always in a dance and need to be in a dance of trust building with the people that they lead, because the people won't have trust with each other if there isn't trust with the leader. You can't or the trust with each other will be built on a common dislike of the leader, but that's not right. That's not a sustainable trust over the long. So yeah, I would agree with you that trust is so critical. And an associate of mine once said to me, it was very profound. He said, you can't do truth telling outside of a container of trust. Because if you don't have a container of trust and you try to do some truth telling, you'll produce trauma in the system. And then, of course, when you produce trauma in the system, people react out of that trauma and you got more trauma. The ball starts rolling. So that trust container, I like thinking about leadership and organizational life, or even group life, societal life, as how are we building trust containers in order to have the conversations that we need to have.
So it's one thing to build trust within an organization, right? When in theory, you should have a lot of objectives and priorities in alignment.
Yeah, true.
Right. Just by nature of, making a company successful. What I'm kind of interested in is the expansion of that to society in general, in particular politics. I mean, the level of trust, the level of polarization that I've seen, within our society over the last several years has never been, level of polarization never so high, level of trust never so low.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, I'm curious about your thoughts on, outside of just an organizational context, what are some of the most important ways that we can build that container of trust? And I realize, these kinds of things don't happen overnight. I mean, it's an incremental kind of a thing, but it's like, we got to start somewhere. We got to do something, right? I mean, to improve the situation over the depths that we've been in.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And just to throw a wrench into that, there's the roots of the polarization that we're in are so multifold, right? We're in a large societal change and communicating differently. And when people are in a change curve, we're really vulnerable to lost trust and really vulnerable to polarization when we're in the middle of a deep change, and we are, just by virtue of community, for multiple reasons, but even just how we communicate is different through the internet and so forth. And that big change puts us into a real vulnerable position around polarization. So, and we've lost trust in institutions, and as a result of that, it doesn't matter who the political leader is, we don't trust the institution generally of the nation, let alone the governing body of the nation. And so we are in a very complex time around societal polarization. The answer to your question, in business, one of the things that we say is trust building happens. If it's not happening from the top, it's not happening. But a nation is so much larger than an organization. And so you could say, well, your president, our prime minister, whoever the leader is, could be doing more to do trust building. That's true. And I think by definition, that's true. And if how transparent are leaders being? How are they communicating care? Those pillars of trust. How are they showing up consistently? Do they have the competence, et cetera? So our leaders can do a fair bit of trust building. And, when I think about healing the political divides in the United States and Canada or elsewhere, I don't know that we can wait for our leaders to get there.
Exactly.
So I'm quite intrigued. I think sometimes about if you think about what happened in Eastern Germany prior to the fall of the wall. And the fall of the wall did not happen because leaders had a change of heart on Eastern Germany side. You had groups rallying, actually faith groups in basements of churches, and they were beginning to develop communities of real motivation to change the dynamic within their country, to work towards freedom and so forth. And so I'd like to take a page out of that book. And essentially what they did at a really, really grassroots level is they began to create communities of change, and communities who are interested in change, and build alliances and trust of people from lots of different stripes of political perspectives to work towards change. And so when I think about undoing this polarization, it's a long haul, building communities of connection. It doesn't change polarization overnight. But, if you were the head of the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever national newspapers, I would be interested in knowing, how is the editor of that newspaper creating, writing in a way that builds trust between polarized divides in the United States? Or like some of the people that you're interviewing, some of the groups like Braver Angels and other groups that are engaged in trust building across divides in the United States and to some degree in here in Canada. Like, how are these smaller groups really building communities of belonging, building communities of trust, building bridges? It feels like it's a small answer to a big problem, but I'm not sure that anything else has ever done it. Right? Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you should, use the East Germany analogy there, and the nature of how that came about, as you said, by kind of a series of loosely connected small groups.
Yeah.
There's a book that I just recently read called Cascades that basically analyzes how major movements have ended up being successful. And East Germany is not one of the ones that they study in that book, but one of the common threads that they point to across, several different examples is this idea of loosely coupled groups that kind of are grassroots form, but end up being in broad alignment with each other to create a major change, which is kind of unexpected, right? I mean, for most of us, at least myself, you kind of think of things being top down.
Yeah.
Like just the example that the president, or congressional leaders or what have you said, or the examples of, faith leaders or, other institutions. And those are less effective now, I would say, than what maybe they were decades ago. So, what fills that void?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know how, there's Braver's Angels, and there's, other groups similar to that, that are trying to foster a kind of more small group related things. But in the case of, Braver Angels, for instance, and several of the others, I mean, it's just starting at the point of just getting people to sit in the same room together and listen to each other. Forget trying to get any kind of agreement or, anything like that, right? It's just like, try to be civil to each other and talk to each other and listen to each other, Yeah. So I guess that's, maybe, baby steps on the road of trust, but.
Yeah, it's baby steps. And in a way, the question, when you can't depend on your leaders to be doing that trust building, in a way, the question that's presented for every one of us is, where, in terms of the context where I am planted, in terms of the skills that I've been given, in terms of the job that I'm employed in what ways can I be a bridge builder in my
Exactly.
And
totally
I think
agree.
We are in a moment a societal moment where this is not a choice. We have to be, each one of us has to be asking that question. How am I bridge building? How am I,
Mhm.
and even in our social conversations. So if you and I were friends and we were talking politics or whatever we're talking, how am I, am I just sending out vitriol, you and I in alignment against whoever we're arguing about? Or are we communicating in a way that opens the door, even in our imagination of the other as human? And, if I think of one mantra that has really come to define my work, or one phrase that has come to define my work over the last number of years, I'm borrowing from Carl Rogers, who was a psychologist in the United States in the 1950s, and, on both sides of that time frame, was this word of unconditional positive regard, and to offer ourselves unconditional positive regard and offer the people that we're engaged with an unconditional positive regard. And that doesn't mean we can't hold accountable. It doesn't mean we can't have hard conversations. It doesn't mean we can't say we disagree, but it means that I look at you or anybody else and say, I choose to offer you as a person unconditional positive regard.
Mm.
I choose to see your humanity. And unconditional positive regard doesn't mean I can't say, hey, that, if you hit me, it doesn't mean I can't say, hey, that was wrong. But I still commit to seeing you as a person. And I think what we've lost in this time is we have a tendency to assume personhood and idea is the same thing. And it's not, we are not our ideas. The personhood of the person, if I can say it that way, the humanity of the person is much more profound and interesting than the ideas they carry.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so how do we nurture an inner discipline, a spiritual discipline? How do we nurture that discipline of seeing the human person as a human being, to seeing the humanity of the other and honoring that humanity? And for me, that term, unconditional positive regard, has been really profound in terms of, it's like the word that I carry with me in every I try anyway, in every encounter, unconditional positive regard, UPR, UPR, UPR.
That's interesting because, I've never heard that term before,
Mhm.
but it is very close to something I concluded for myself decades ago in business, which was, I want to trust someone until they prove to me I can't trust them.
Right.
Right. It's the same, offering unconditional positive regard, right? It's
Right.
not, doesn't mean that it's permanent.
Right.
Doesn't mean
Well,
it can't be violated, but it's a starting point, right? It's
that's right.
choosing a starting point.
And then even if that person violates your trust, you can still offer unconditional positive regard for the personhood, even though you have new information about what you'll trust them with or not.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right? Like I think
you're right. It's not a black and white thing. It's nuanced.
It's nuanced, and it's a little bit like this foundational belief that when you strip everything away, what that person has done in their lives, all the good and all the bad, everything away, there's still a breath. There's still a person worthy of dignity and worthy of being honored. You can't, when people get into, when people work with people who have been in prison and who have engaged in really awful things, how do those folks do it?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
They do it because they refuse to not, am I saying that too many negatives? They commit to seeing the humanity of the person despite what that person has done. And sort of remembering the kernel of the kernel of humanity that allows us to see that person, to regard to that person with dignity. And I think that unconditional positive regard, even if that person is distasteful, there's still a human being there.
Sure.
And there's a life story that's led to the distastefulness, usually. And if we can honor that, I think we can hold accountable more effectively. That's the irony of it. If I begin with dislike and distrust and disregard for the other, then holding you accountable comes through is filtered through my lens of disgust. Well, and then you're going to resist me. But if I hold you accountable through the lens of unconditional positive regard, you know yourself to be cared for at the same time as I'm holding accountable. Well, that's a much easier thing to say yes to.
Mm-hmm.
Like shaming somebody into transformation in my experience, doesn't work very well.
So let's talk a little bit more about you. So I want the audience to learn more about your work and your books and things. So Credence and Company, can you let people know a little bit more about what the company does?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So we are, our focus is supporting leaders, engaging teams, transforming organizations. If I could say it most simply, we work with workplaces and also faith-based institutions, including communities of faith. So both the workplaces and faith-based organizations. We do training, we do organizational health assessments, we do conflict and mediation and uh, like restorative, like helping workplace restoration, community restoration following conflict, that kind of stuff. Facilitation, planning, equity, diversity, inclusion work, change management, strategic planning. I think of us as did I say coaching? I think of ourselves as a wraparound service, all focused on helping the people, the institution to be well and the people in the institution to be well, including the leaders. And so we have a team of 12 staff. I would say that what defines us as an organization, and around 2012, we went through an exercise where we tried to establish our core values. And we landed on love, listen, lead.
Say that again?
We landed on love, listen, lead as our core value.
Love, listen, lead.
So we will love the people we work with unconditionally, unconditional positive regard. We will deeply honor the organization and its people. We will listen really carefully and we will lead. We've got lots of experience, lots of insights to bring, and we will lead. But we will do that in a way that listens well and loves. And so it's those three values, I think, have been absolutely defining in our work. A number of years ago, I was working with a very large department at a university, and I needed to deliver a report. I'd done an organizational health assessment and needed to deliver a report, and they were quite nervous about it because it had some hard pieces to it. And after it was over, one of the people said to me, "You know what you folks do? You know what you do? You do compassionate consulting." And I thought, okay, I'll take that. Because they were afraid we would come in and just tell them what was wrong with them and leave. But we did it with grace and with some education around, what they were experiencing was normal, and it's not overwhelming. We can find our way through it, and you're good people, and there's some tweaks you need to make in order to be healthier. So anyway, that's a little bit about who we are.
That's very cool. And you work with clients across North America?
Across North America, yeah, and some in Europe as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're headquartered in Ontario, is that correct?
That's right. Absolutely.
And so, but you do things probably virtually as well as in person, I would assume, these days.
Yes, we were on Zoom before COVID. Yes, COVID has really enhanced the virtual nature of our work because now everybody gets Zoom. Everybody knows how that works, or Microsoft Teams, or whatever it is. So yeah, we do work both virtually and in person. Yeah.
Almost like the telephone, right? I mean, when the introduction of the telephone took place, it was massive adoption. And, we've seen that again with video telephony, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, exactly.
Finally, after decades of other previous attempts, wherein the bandwidth and other things weren't ready. But in any event, I'd like to also tell folks more about your book. I mentioned the title, The Space Between Us, Conversations About Transforming Conflict. What motivated you to write that book? Sure.
A couple of things. One of them is I teach a lot of workshops, and people would often ask at the end of the workshop, "So have you got a book?" I said, "Well, I've thought about it." And anyway, so it was time to actually write it. The other thing that motivated me to write the book was I had always felt like I wanted to write something. And so in 2019, I defended a thesis, a doctorate, my PhD defense, I guess. And the thesis had three primary conclusions, and the book but the thesis was written for a very academic environment. And so and in fact, my thesis supervisor said, it needs to be dry. If it's not dry, they won't pass you. So don't take everything interesting out of it. So I tried to make it dry. But if I wanted some of the ideas to be able to be accessible to a larger audience. So I took one of the conclusions from the thesis and I put it into the book. So that's what caused or motivated me to write the book.
So that begs the question, are there two more books then for the other two elements of the thesis?
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about, yeah, I'm currently working on a book on one of the conclusions was about polarization. And so I'm currently working on something related to polarization.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any
So,
idea when that'll be
oh, well,
available?
well, I had
Too early?
hoped, no, well, my plan is I've got most of 2023 summer blocked off to write. And
Hmm.
so my hope is I will, I'll keep playing with it between now and summer, but hopefully by the end of summer, I'll have a manuscript that's close to ready to go. So that's my hope.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we'll look forward to that.
Mhm.
Um, so the book, that we just talked about, that you already have. Who would you say it's most intended for?
Sure. Well, that's actually an interesting question because when you write a book, people say, well, who's the audience? Because that should define. And my audience is diverse. And I was trying really hard to speak to the different types of audiences that are interested in the book. So I'm hoping that the book is interesting to practitioners of
Mm.
conflict and transformation, but also to the average reader. And, my mom is in English as a second language. She's in her late 80s, and she has read the book twice. She sometimes needs a dictionary, but, it is accessible, I think, to people from a broad range of interests. So from that perspective. But the other thing that's interesting for me is because our work involves workplaces and communities of faith, I was trying to write in a way that spoke to both of those.
Hmm.
And so there are some elements in the book that speak more directly to communities of faith, Christian in particular. And my understanding, my hope was, and people have given me the feedback, that even if you're not a person of faith, you can either ignore those sections or read them and find them interesting as just as an observer, I guess. But people have not found those to be a barrier if they're not connected to that kind of a community. So I was working, trying to write the book that spoke to both of those sets
Hmm.
of things.
Hmm.
Mhm.
So let's talk now about the chapter that you wrote in the second How to Heal Our Divides book. The title of that chapter is Courageous Compassion in the Transformation of Conflict. And in that chapter, you talk about many different sources of, several types of division that people often encounter. And you use the example of a specific company that you were asked to support. So can you tell us a little bit about how that experience exemplifies a broader set of issues?
Yeah. So one of the things that I find really interesting about this work is that it's a little bit like a puzzle, or, if you have a ball of yarn that's really knotted and you take it apart and then you put it back together in the end and it's no longer knotted.
Mhm.
When you think of whether it's a nation in conflict or a nation that's polarized or a company that's in conflict or polarized, there are so many different pieces. And what's interesting about the work is kind of unpuzzling it, or puzzling it out. Like what are the different pieces of the puzzle that help us to understand what's going on? And in that particular story that I wrote, there were so many different pieces of that puzzle. So for example, there was some plain old miscommunication. There were structural issues. They were structured in a kind of a wonky way that caused people to bump into each other in a way that they didn't need to.
Mhm.
Some of the key leaders had trauma histories,
Mhm.
and the conflict caused trauma, and it also triggered trauma from trauma memories for people. So there was that kind of that
Wow.
personal dynamic. There were interpersonal conflicts. There was the use of power and the misuse of power. And there was also significant historically in this organization conflict avoidance or hard conversation avoidance. And so things grew and grew and people said positive things when they were trying to actually say negative things. Like instead of being critical, they were saying positive things when they were trying to be critical. So there were so many different ways, or you could say there's even people who had good intentions, but they couldn't translate those good intentions into concrete actions that helped. So there was just so many different factors that were
Mhm.
present in this case that speak to me of the dynamics that are so common in the diversity of workplaces or communities with which I work.
Mhm.
Like, does the structure actually cause you to fall into conflict? Are there trauma histories or mental health dynamics that are causing people to fall into conflict? What's the larger social environment that's causing stress for the organization? We have a tendency in polarization and conflict to make it personal. You are here, I'm here, we're divided, or you're bad, I'm right, you're wrong, that kind of stuff. And if we can look at the broader context, we can often find reasons why people are bumping into each other. And if we can fix some of that, it's easier for the people to thrive.
Hmm.
There's a saying in conflict resolution work, which is to solve conflict, change people problems into situation problems. Because we tend to take everything as a people problem. You're bad, right? I'm bad, you're bad, we're all bad. As opposed to what's the situation? And how is the situation causing us to bump into each other in a way that we wouldn't need to fix the situation? And sometimes what's tricky though is sometimes the situation is within. Like in this case, the leader had a trauma history which he brought to bear into the system.
Wow.
Right? And the system triggered his trauma history. And so, and this is why leadership is such a big deal, because you have such more power to influence people. But what's my duty? What's my moral duty as a leader? To take care of my own stuff so that my stuff doesn't get in the way of the organization's health. Yeah.
Interesting. So you've been doing this work for several years. How has it evolved, or what are some of the newer trends, so to speak, the newer aspects of this that are more prevalent today than maybe were in the past?
In terms of what people are wrestling with or how the work is being done?
Probably more what people are wrestling with.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting. We have like before COVID and after COVID. What I would say that one of the things that we're wrestling with today is an incredible level of fatigue among leaders, among staff, people who are not in leadership positions, and a level of fatigue that's significant enough that it's limiting people's ability to invest in each other.
Wow.
It's limiting people's ability to invest in interpersonal conversations that matter, hard conversations. It's like, why bother? And people have a tendency to retreat into their own corners, I guess. So I think the fatigue is part of it. And part of it, these are all interconnected like a Venn diagram. Another one would be, we are so vulnerable at this moment of this, we've already talked about polarization, but falling into these us-them dynamic. You're them, I'm us. If I'm us, I am beyond, whatever. I don't do wrong, you do all wrong. Like that us-them dynamic is, and if you take that us-them dynamic between leaders and staff, and leaders feel then like, I can do nothing right, so why bother? And we have a tendency then to see the worst in each other and the best in we see ourselves from the best of our intentions, and we see the other through the worst of their impact. And that's a disconnect, right?
Sure.
I don't see myself through my impact. I see myself through my intentions, and I see you through your impact. And so there's always been that us-them dynamic. It feels like that's on steroids right now. And so trying to navigate the current social environment through the us-them dynamic, like one of the things that happened in COVID is that gave us permission to start looking at ourselves in different ways. And so, for example, the real focus on anti-racism has really increased in the context of COVID, both anti-Black racism and certainly here in Canada, anti-Indigenous racism, and the whole history of pain associated with how Canadian society has dealt with Indigenous communities and individuals. And that's really good that we're wrestling with racism finally. What's true about that is that it has also created, it has put people on edge a little bit, in the sense that they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. In some communities that we work with, they are highly divided, sometimes over race, sometimes over LGBTQ inclusion, so issues of sexuality, issues of race, issues of historical wrongs. What's my duty around that? So and then when you have competing marginalizations, so this person experiences this person as misogynist, this person experiences this person as racist. They are both fighting with each other, and they're both experiencing an ism. And trying to resolve that conflict between them is profoundly complex. Because everybody's got an ism that's their, that they've been harmed. And I'm not saying it's not true. It's just that which one trumps the other. Which one? So we're dealing with some very complex levels of conflict today. And then I would say the other thing that I'm seeing is, we are living in a time with this very heightened individualism, this change that we're living in. People are experiencing a loss of meaning, a loss of belonging, a loss of connection, a loss of purpose. And if we don't have sense of personal meaning, we know that meaning is one of our 5 foundational human needs. And having a sense of meaning in life, having a sense of connection, belonging is another foundational human need. Recognition is a foundational human need. Self-determination, security. And in a time of social change, all 5 of those are under threat. And when those are under threat, people either get polarized or they feel malaise, that why bother feeling. And so we are in a time, and then it creates pressure in the workplace. It has to be the place of meaning. It has to be the place of belonging. It has to be a place of connection. It has to be a place of all these things. Or in the religious community, if that's the context, or the social community. And so we are dealing with, so how have things changed? We've always had conflict. We've always been, societies are always in flux. And we're in a time of heightened anxiety. I refer to the age that we're living in as the age of anxiety. And that heightened anxiety is putting pressure on each other, putting pressure on ourselves, and making our social relationships more difficult, which produces more conflict.
So you talk about fatigue, kind of us, them, and, kind of like loss of meaning, purpose, and things like that. So let me ask you the second part of the question then that, you were alluding to a moment ago. So what do you do about it? What kinds of new tools have you employed to deal with, or obviously some very difficult things?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So a couple of things. One of them, and it really points back to the book that I wrote, in a way to the chapter as well. When I began as a mediator in 93, I began. I began as a mediator in 93. We would interview clients and we would send them directly to mediation straight away. We just don't do that anymore. And maybe some places do, we don't. And the reason we don't is we would interview people and then spend significant time in coaching before bringing people to mediation. Now, some places we would spend one session of coaching, others multiple sessions of coaching before mediation. And the reason being is to fortify people, to help them to be at their best in the presence of the other. But the other piece to it is there is a really clear understanding that the transformation of the relationship depends on the transformation of self. And it's much easier to have hard conversations in the presence of a trusted coach than it is in the presence of the person that you're having a conflict with.
Sure.
And so we've invested pretty heavily in nurturing that coaching environment between the interview and the mediation, or whatever the conflict process is, in order to help people to be at their best in the session, and also to give space for self-reflection and transformation. The face-to-face with the other party in some level is the icing on the cake. It doesn't mean it's easy, but this in-between space of one-on-one conversation to really build trust, to really create a container of trust, I guess you could say, going back to the beginning of our conversation, and helping people to have those conversations with us. That would be one way in which the work has changed. Other ways that the work has changed, I would say in terms of the training that we offer, the teaching we do, leans a lot more, and maybe this is connected to what I just said, on how are we showing up? Like, how are you showing? Like, self-compassion, and leaning into self-compassion, leaning into unconditional positive regard. When I began my career, conflict resolution world was about a set of skills. And now it's about a package of meaning.
Hmm.
in addition to a set of skills. And the package of meaning is, it's not just why is this happening, but what's true about you, and how do you become the person that you need to become in order to be a person of grace and, in this situation, in order to be healed in this situation, or to be a healing person in this situation. Um, and then, so that would be one end of things, but on the other end of things, having a really robust social analysis. How do we understand the structure of what's going on? How do we understand the system, the systemic dynamics? And whereas in the conflict transformation world, in 93, it was all about what happened in the mediation room. Now it's about the social analysis, or the structural analysis, the systems analysis, and the personal. Now, that doesn't mean we have forgotten this, but these two pieces are as important or even more important.
Yeah, I bet.
This is easy. If you get these two things fixed, this is easy.
I totally can see that. I mean, just throwing people in a room, without fixing some of the other problems isn't, to me, going to seem likely to solve the problem.
Exactly.
But you're getting to some of the fundamental things. I can totally see what you're saying about it's easier for a person to open up and change themselves
Mm-hmm.
in the context of a trusted third party,
Yeah.
as opposed to the enemy, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
The issue, I guess, is, how do we apply this more broadly? Back again to our discussion about society at large, right? I mean, my goodness. I mean, other than, sending you to Congress, to
Help them vote for somebody.
to meet with, at least in the U.S., either the entire Senate or House of Representatives individually. I don't think any of that's going to happen anytime soon. But how do we scale, beyond just, kind of a one-on-one coaching model, I guess?
Right. That's a fair question. Well, we do group coaching as well, and that can be helpful. We teach lots of workshops. It's why I'm writing a book again, right? Like, trying to scale in that way. Many universities today have, not all of them obviously, but have courses in conflict transformation, right? So there are ways in which, at a younger level, people are working at this. There's been a lot of work done on leadership studies. So, beyond what we do, I feel like there's lots of different places in society where people are trying to, and they're trying, but I guess I come back to unconditional positive regard. Do we love the people that we're in conflict with? And maybe that sounds a little bit too Pollyanna, but at the end of the day, if I can't find my capacity for honor and dignity for the person with whom I'm having a really difficult time, we don't have a hope. And even if I think about, big peace building initiatives, and people who are out there doing peace building work, we're so vulnerable to dividing the world into us and them. Like, think of Ukraine and Russia right now. Like, it's so tempting to divide the world, like, to see, and we can still see right and wrong there. It's wrong to be invading another country. It's wrong to be bombing another country. And am I remembering that there's a human being on the other side of this? Am I remembering that the people on the other side of this conflict are worthy of dignity and regard and unconditional positive regard, even when we say it's wrong? And I guess if I have one message that I'm trying to say over and over again, it's we cannot make change through the lens of hate. We cannot make change through the lens of disregard. We just can't. Mm-hmm. And how do we nurture the impulse or the muscle? How do we develop the muscle within our beings to regard the other with dignity? I think that's the foundation of it all.
Very powerful words to live by, I guess. So the more I think we can all do to try to spread that approach would help us so much. So Betty, I really appreciate, all the work that you've done, and appreciate you being here with us today. Please stay in touch. as things progress, and certainly as your new book does come out. I want to help get the word out about it, and we can talk more about that in depth, obviously, when the time is right. But in the meantime, please check out Credence and Company and Betty's book, The Space Between Us, Conversations About Transforming Conflict, from Herald Press. Betty, thanks again, and best wishes on all the work that you do.
Thanks so much, Brian. It's lovely to be here with you.
Okay, thanks, everyone.
All right, take care.